Boston, the Boston you didn't know, the history you never learned, probably never even heard. Some of the concepts you may be familiar with. Some of the concepts with which you are not familiar will possibly be astounding and shocking. I know they were to me, and I thought I was up on this stuff. So let's begin. Well, we know Boston, like every great city in the world, had a major fire, oft referred to as a conflagration. Con, flag, as in false flag, gration. So if you look at the devastation, you will see melted iron, you'll see dust, you'll see rubble, you'll see huge solid marble stones broken to bits, you'll see marble melted, and you'll see men surveying the damage they've wrought. Yes, you won't see much black soot from a fire. You won't see much charred areas where the flames rose and lapped against nearby buildings. No, you won't see that. You'll see soldiers guarding the boundaries that have been cordoned off, policemen. You will see large entranceways amongst the rubble and large floors where the people walked through, people of stature perhaps much greater than today. The photos will be almost like action shots, and they didn't have to stay still like you've been taught. And the buildings that have been destroyed, you will see, have been destroyed for a very specific purpose. And you'll see anomalies like this wooden beam being held up by wires. No idea. I have no idea about some of these things. I do know to ask the questions. Is it rebar? Is it rebar holding up concrete? What some of these things are, I don't know. How did they, why did they build some of these buildings so tall? Did they build them at all? I think the more you look at it, the more questions you have. So the way that I want to go through this, besides just a quick look at these amazing pictures, is to, I'm using several methods, but mainly what we're going to do in this documentary about Boston that I'm doing, we are going to go through the history that was kept by the fire department, because it seems that at the heart of all this destruction is a fire, ostensibly just a fire, like all the cities supposedly had in the late 1800s or the second half of the 19th century, 1800s. And the fire department's records, however, well, they tell a story not unlike 9/11 or what's happened recently in Paradise, CA. What is going on here? Is that's just the blur of smoke rising? Maybe. You're going to see these spires. They're not lightning rods. They might be. I'm sure they did attract lightning or route lightning like a lightning rod, but they were electricity. And these steel frames, that may be a scaffolding. Maybe. But you'll see all kinds of things that should not be, at least not at that time. You'll see Roman architecture. Well, you're seeing it now. We're getting into it. a little bit. But going through the fire department's history, there are some things that came up that were truly amazing. Now, I imagine they pulled horses with like sled attachments in order to move this stuff over, but it's almost like they ran a bulldozer. Amazing what they could do with horses. Just the handiwork back then, building these castle-like structures. Look at that. The buildings were targeted, if you ask me. This is the so-called new post office, and does it look like it was ever occupied before they pulled it down? Things sticking out of the walls, antenna things out the wazoo, some kind of structure up there. What is it? Kind of a scaffolding, kind of a metal. What's the purpose for those portholes? They're going to put clocks everywhere? I don't think so. Greco-Roman, overdone. That looks like where the king would address the court at the city, you know. It just looks out of time, just like from a different time. Look at the man up there. Look at him compared to those windows. It's built for giants. You know it is built for giants. The scope and scale of the destruction was immense. And here you see, in this basically aerial shot or tower view shot photograph, it's like it looks like some of it may still be smoldering, making the making those white marks, but it looks like old Rome or something. Look at the size of these doorways. They're huge, and that's, I think, the main reason they want to get rid of it. It's just, obviously, it's for giants. And how could they have kept people from talking about it? Well, we'll get to that, but just look at those doorways in there. Just many, many, many times too high. Much, much higher than it needed to be. And it's just turned to dust. And of course we've seen that. We've seen that before. But they didn't turn everything to dust. Some of it remained in every single doorway, interior and exterior. I'm not talking about just the main entrance. Interior and exterior they were, for those of a much greater stature. And again, on the second floor you have similarly high ceilings. Why? Why would you have that? It would be a nightmare to heat that. And I know that they had trains back then. I'm not saying that this is ahead of its time. They had rails and trains for a long, long time. Why wouldn't you? It's an efficient way to move heavy things. But they were more prevalent on the streets in the late 1800s than they are today. We have gone backwards as far as rail lines on the streets. It makes sense to have electric rail cars on any city street. They had them in every city back then. Every city. Every city I've done so far, every single one had electric trolleys. Every single one. Here again, we have soldiers guarding what? Guarding this rubble? Well, they're guarding the information. How this person was allowed to take the photograph, I'm not sure. But they were keenly watched by the soldiers, who are ostensibly protecting this single wooden shutter that survived this huge fire. A complete history of the Boston Fire Department, the Fire Alarm Service, and the Protective Department from 1630 to 1888, arranged in 3 parts. Well, let's get started. We're going to just kind of skip through a lot of these and cover the interesting things. Now, bear in mind, I didn't skip through. I read this entire thing. I stopped after the Great Fire. There wasn't... I just didn't have the endurance to go beyond 1872 because it's 762 pages from 18... when did it start here? 1630 to 1872 gets you to about page 350. 1872 or 1873 to 1888, gets you from page about 350 to page 762. Yeah. Now that tells you a lot right there. But we'll go on. And so in the foreword, or the introduction by the author, he says, the information for the history of the Boston Fire Department has been very difficult to obtain, owing... I mean, if it's difficult to obtain the history, how are you going to explain the difficulty of obtaining the history? The very fact that you don't know because the history isn't clear speaks volumes. You don't need to add to it. How are you going to... How can you explain... I don't know. Do you see what I mean by that? It's kind of a oxymoronic thing to say. And I just coined that term. I don't know. I haven't heard anybody do that yet. Owing to the unsatisfactory manner in which the records have been left. In fact, there is no register of events made by the department in existence. The data previous to 1840 being scattered over numerous sources. Sorcery. In the task of research, I have given the care and patience the subject demanded, and trust I have succeeded in combining into one volume all the important matters in relation to the department heretofore have been distributed through hundreds. Okay, so a lot of it is mundane and boring. However, I've gleaned some very, very telling and important points out of this otherwise mundane information, which I will share to you as basically something akin to a litmus test for finding the truth of the matter, for lack of a better term, of what's going on. Because from 1822 to about 1860 or so, a lot of it just seems to be hearsay and, well, we'll get right into it here. But he goes on with more excuses about it. And I won't read them all, but he'll say, you know, one firehouse will have some kind of memory engraved on the wall, or some story transferred to other quarters where somebody succeeded somebody else, and they only retain just a fraction of the history. You know, kind of like the thing where if you've ever taken a job and the person you're replacing in the job just is supposed to work with you for 2 weeks or something, and they end up only working with you for about a day or two. That's all they can take it. You know, that's all they can take. And in that day or two, you'll hear them mumbling, or they may just flat out tell you something that has to do with the history of the company you're working with. And then, if you're like me, you have like a photographic memory of those types of things because they could end up being very important. So you pay very close attention, and over time, you get a feel for the company, the people. Even if they're very secretive, you get a sense for whatever the person said, if it was bunk or not. And it usually is not bunk when they tell you that when they're leaving, because they don't care anymore. But anyway, so they stopped this history after December the 31st, 1888. Because at that point, things actually were being recorded in a acceptable manner. So the reason for this history from 1630 to 1888 is predicated by the fact that they didn't have a proper recording of what they were doing. And for a country 100 years old, they haven't gotten a handle on such a basic task is quite shocking. So we'll just move forward here and find that his closing statement, and this was written in well, it was written, this forward, it says 1889, but this was published later. But anyway, he says the plan of this history is original with the author. It is therefore with feeling akin to trepidation. So trepidation means uneasiness, that he places it before the public. But it will fulfill his desire should it give the people of Boston the necessary records. The people of Boston needed the necessary records of service, of which they may justly feel proud, and the citizens of the United States will have then a history of at least the fire departments organized in the country for the purpose and protection of that most gratifying servant but fearful master, fire. So at the end, again, they're just telling you, after this litany of excuses, substitutes are omitted, dates of appointments, registrations are left blank. It's owing to the fact there are no records to supply the correct information. So look, this history is original. It's written by this author. In other words, it's a fiction. It is therefore with feeling akin to trepidation that he places it before the public. But hey, at least it'll fulfill a desire to give people of Boston something, so they have the records that you would expect them to have of a service. So that why? Because it's the truth? No, it's just so they can just feel proud, justly feel proud. Well, I guess he is kind of alluding to the fact that of truth in the basis of it. He's saying that they can feel proud, but the citizens of the United States need a history of the first department organized in this country. They just need a history. They didn't have it because there maybe wasn't. So let's look at chapter 1, actually starting in 1627. Massachusetts is purchased. Purchased. From whom? From whom do you purchase Massachusetts? The colonists depart England, settle in Boston, or depart, they didn't depart England, they departed Jamestown, or we'll get to it, a different colony, I think. Set the boundary of the town, maybe. They don't say set. Growth, and then the fires begin. The first building law, and they outlawed fire. This is funny. They outlawed fire in 1653, and they outlaw fire about 100 times more throughout the years. They keep outlawing fire. They'll probably outlaw fire this year. It's against the law. It's against the law for fire. And it's according to the law that things must be protected against fire. Then they have a law regarding pulling down buildings, which is going to be a continual thing here. So, and then allowances to owners of houses for having their buildings demolished. Demolished. You're a brand new colony. We're talking the 16 something in America. And right away we're talking about what? Burning stuff. We're talking about gunpowder, orders for having your buildings demolished, provisions about gunpowder, because you have to have powder, and pulling the law regarding pulling down buildings. And my gosh, what's going on? What is going on right from the beginning? And you would think that everything would be like especially in the mid 1600s, you're going to have places called Castle Island, and the castle burned July 19th, 1672. Burning of the castle on Castle Island. Okay, historians, esteemed professors of history, please explain to me. Please explain to me, because I don't understand. Why is there a castle in Boston just a few years after the very first colonists depart? And from whom did they purchase this castle and all the land of Massachusetts? I am confused, because they did not teach me in history about people going ahead of the colonists. What, Native Americans built the castles? Who built these castles? And why did they suddenly burn? I mean, you're going into a land that is reportedly and ostensibly just a wilderness with some teepees and wigwams, and you just happen to find a freaking castle on an island there, and on an island, and you guys, and they go and they burn it down, and they're just mainly concerned with pulling down and demolishing buildings. And then it's just one fire after the other from then on. I mean, ad nauseum. Now, one thing I have to mention is, in these early histories, well, they have a lot of mention of smallpox. But in these early histories, they have, obelisk. I didn't notice that before. There's an obelisk that burned. How does a stone obelisk burn? How does a stone obelisk burn? So much strangeness, I tell you. But okay, so this is just the table of contents here. So we'll just jump ahead. I mean, that kind of gets, it's kind of spoiler alert here. So I'm just going to go through. We don't want the spoilers. We just want to get right into it. So Charleston, that was that one. So they went from Charlestown, and they safely landed. So these are the first of the first, other than the scouts. A little band sailed from Yarmouth, England, in the ship Arbella, and they landed on Endicott, and they weren't pleased, and they reported to land in Charlestown. And so they went to Charlestown, but there wasn't much fresh water, objectionable features. I need more detail, but they don't give it. And then get this, they accepted the invitation of Mr. William Blackstone, or Blackstone, who had settled at Boston, or Shawmut, living fountain, as it was called by the Indians and by the Native Americans and by the people of Charlestown. It was called Tri-Mountain. So that's the real name of the civilization who lived there, was either Tri-Mountain or Shawmut. It's probably kind of a combination. The town took its present name after they bastardized it. Tri-Mountain shall be called Boston, Mattapan, Dorchester, and the town upon Charles River, Watertown. Well, okay. So they settled it. They talk about the dimensions. And then 75 years pass. It was not until after the first 75 years of the settlement that the various streets and public avenues had fixed and determined names. Consequently, all the estates that bordered on them were described as bounded on the street or lane running from some well-known landmark to another. And when they say landmark, they're not talking about a geological feature. They're talking about a massive, massive castle-like building, like a coliseum or something. And then so this is interesting. There's a street that was named the way leading from the orange tree to the ferry. And then they ended up calling it Hanover Street. And then they called the lower North Highway North Street because they had a raised highway. So they make mention that there was hardly a building west of the present Tremont Street, but I'm not sure I believe that at all, because the streets had no names. You know the song by U2, where the streets have no names. It's because it's a wiped civilization, but the city's still there. So they have Fort Hill is already there. And this is interesting. They say mud houses were known in the early days, but they were very few, and of course only occupied by the very poorest of the colonists. The buildings were generally of wood, although a few were of stone and brick. I think it was the other way around. But until the town was at least 20 years of age, these were exceptions. See? The dwellings were generally of 1 story in height, with roofs covered with thatch or boughs of trees. Now that tells you. So it was buried in mud, and it had earth on top of it, including entire trees growing on tops of the buildings. So they just cleared out the top floor of a very tall building buried in mud, and that is what the mud houses were. And so since it was already there, you didn't have to have money. If you squatted it, that's what was happening. And I think that's how the Native Americans were treating them. I don't think the Native Americans were here very long at that time either. Things are changing the way that you have to look at these. histories. They didn't have any fires until March 16th, 1630 or 31, when Governor Winthrop records in his journal that they had a chimney fire. So I had a break here, called a break. It did work, but I don't consider this work. It's fun. So I'm back at it now. And during this time, I took another look at this page, and I want to just call this out a little bit. So they're saying mud houses were known in the early days, but there were very few, of course, only occupied by the very poorest of colonists. The buildings were generally of wood, few were of stone and brick. But until the town was at least 20 years of age, these were exceptions. The first dwellings were generally 1 story in height, with roofs covered with thatch or boughs of trees. But as time passed, those who could afford it built their houses of 2 stories in front, with a shingled roof that ran nearly to the ground in the rear, leaving but 1 story exposed. In time, lapped or double roofs were in order. So it's not hard to consider, at least for me, based on what I've seen evidence-wise, that these could have been like the tops of taller buildings, like skyscrapers that were just exposed. And so they were, the rooftops of the buildings, that maybe the rooftops had collapsed, and the townspeople just kind of dig it out and then put that in. And then when they say the lapped or double roofs, they could be talking about lapping the shingles, and that's what you're supposed to think, but it could be a spin. They were spinning it, where they were actually adding a floor where the height of the floor was so high that you could actually add another whole level and still have plenty of headroom in there. But either way, moving on. Thunderstorm passed through. And then this is interesting. During the latter part of March 1645, there happened at Roxbury an explosion of 17 or 18 barrels of the town's stock of gunpowder, which was stored in the house of John Johnson. Interesting name. The shock shook the houses in Boston like an earthquake and blew burning cinders beyond the meeting house. Created quite a panic. The early records of Roxbury were destroyed by this fire. Well, isn't that convenient? Although there are no records of any later conflagrations until the Great Fire of 1653, there are many great fires, each one's bigger than the previous. Still, from the extensive preparations made by the citizens in 1651, it may be surmised that the inhabitants were not a little troubled with the danger, as well as with the Injuns, Native Americans, that is. The first action taken by the inhabitants, and then the outlawed fire again in 1651. Fires against the law. And there's much mention, I want to point this out very distinctly. There's much mention of God, the Lord, Jesus, God saw fit, the Lord saw fit, and this and that type of thing, okay? Much mention of the Lord God. And then there's a point that we'll come to, and it's very, very important. And it was one of the things, the thing that really shocked me the most about the many, many shocking things that I learned about in here, all of which are very, very prescient to other matters as well. Here's a fire at 1653. How did it start? It was kindled in the open air near some building or woodpile, and was the work of some evil persons to destroy the town. For the General Court held in 1652 passed the following law: they outlawed fire. Here they have waterworks. Here there are fountains and wells, and what they had to do was just dig a trench and lay down pipes or waterworks or conveyances to just tap into what was already there. Okay? So that was interesting, that was already all worked out. They talk about like conduits, and there's this story about how they laid out a whole bunch of pipe and conduits, but they had an issue with permits. And this is, can you believe that they would have an issue with permits? And it meant that it never fulfilled the object. Like, they laid all this pipe and built all these aqueducts and conveyances and waterworks buildings and all this stuff, and it was allowed to go into decay just a few years later. I don't believe it, but it's, again, you read it over and over and over again. So I would not think that they would have problems like that. But here are many fires. But here again, I want to point this out. Providence of God. He praised God. Preach every Lord's Day, that kind of stuff, okay? And successively awakening the whole city and enlightening and awakening its ministry, that kind of stuff. Now, this is very important. I have it mega double outlined. I don't always do that when it's super important, but I thought of it this time. So they finish outlawing fire, and then what's the next thing that happens? Gunpowder was used in the late fire for the first time in the town for blowing up buildings in order to arrest the progress of the fire. Now, with what success, it's not stated why. But as it continued to be practiced, and they continued to do it, it must have been, the author is conjecturing, and falsely by the way, that it was thought to be a valuable agent for this purpose many years after the fact. Yet, to this present day, they still think it must have had its advantages. Yet Captain Everdeen, first Captain Everdeen was paid, for half a barrel, 20 pounds of powder to blow up a house. So it must have been pretty well shattered. The widow was allowed recompense for her house being destroyed in this manner, and many daring attempts were made by incendiaries to destroy the town. Really? Why? Incendiaries. Is that a person or what? I guess. Arsons, I guess. And judging from the methods adopted, they studied plans of some secret and determined gangs of firebugs. All right, so this practice of blowing up the buildings, I think that was the main objective, actually. And so this secret sect, and we know who they are now. It's, the controllers of the town, the Freemasons that created the false reality there. A candle it's just arson. So here are arsons, and they made a second attempt to burn a house, and they wrapped up the house in flames, and it went from building to building because the roof and sides were combustible, apparently. All the warehouses were laid waste, 80 dwelling houses, and it was the most woeful Boston had ever seen to that point, because it gets worse and worse. So complete was its ravages that much trouble was experienced by the people in determining the bounds of their estates and blah, blah, blah. They couldn't even find where their house was, is what he said. So they said it's the joining and the nearness of the buildings. They were going to stop doing that to prevent loss for the future. And then they passed a law outlawing fire again. This time they said no house shall be erected and set up except of stone or brick and covered with slate or tile. So there shouldn't be any more fires ever, right? After that, because at this point they're still like I said, there's a lot of goodwill and whatever. They're being controlled. They don't know it. It's kind of like how we were, but they even were they demanded, that God, they involved their understanding of God, their in their public affairs at that time to a great extent. Not too many fires, not too many people died or anything. Then we have the Revolutionary War, and you'd think that there would be tons of devastation. There's some, but why did buildings burn down? Well, it wasn't for lack of any force willing to put the fires out. There were volunteer fire forces and paid. In 1775, I cried fire. Nobody came. I was stopped by a soldier. He said it was against orders to fight the fire. He threatened to knock my brains out if I did not keep still. Sounds like today, right? When I arrived at the fire, there was no engine. They called them engines back then. And I asked the reason for such an extraordinary delay, and he was told by an engine man that he had that he had bent his engine, but the bayonets were too thick. So they had a group of soldiers with bayonets holding him back. After the fire had been long raging, anyway. They lost 20,000 pounds, British pounds. It's a lot. Okay, and then the very curious and valuable orrery constructed by Mr. Pope, a watchmaker, was carefully and happily saved. So I wanted to look that up, the orrery, because I saw it on the maps, the early maps, and see what this place is like. Oh, and then this is interesting. When Mr. Pope, the watchmaker, he had many hordes of books, instruments, papers, prints. Sounds like me. And he was able to move them all in a single hour after collecting them for 50 years into a helter-skelter heap in an adjoining pasture. And then he stayed for the night at a neighbor's house, returned the next day, and one of his daughters said that her papa was the first thing they thought of moving. Upon this, he began to distinguish between persons and things, and would have brought in a long criticism if I had not changed the discourse to some inquiries about the Great Fire in the year 1711, which he remembered. You know, he is a curiosity. Sounds like they love him, but he's different, but he's cool. Anyway. And calamities, the want of water. So now something that, so that was, when was this? What year was that? Let's go back. So that was just after the Revolutionary War. Now we're jumping up. Now we're in 1822. What happened? We went from the Revolutionary War and we jumped ahead. All of a sudden, 1822, and I want you to notice this, something changed. There's no longer any mention of Christians, Christianity. I think it's possible that a great many people disappeared. Rapture style, like, you know, Left Behind type thing, like the movie Left Behind, not half of your derriere. That's not the Left Behind I'm talking about. You know. But seriously, it's really odd. So all of a sudden, it became evident that the change in habits and sympathies of the population and the recent and increasing infusion of foreigners rendered a change in the organization and system of defense against fire, and they had to enact policing, and it's just the beginning of their troubles. It proved to be an absolute failure. They had to start over. They were starting over from scratch all of a sudden. What happened? Some associations were formed. They attempt evidence the utter hopelessness of any such reliance. Something changed. So, the dog sees something. Examine it. This building had 210 rooms. But they say, a committee of wards investigated, said, that building wasn't as valuable as reported. Really? So what did they do? Well, they got together and they outlawed fire. An act to secure town from the damage by fire was passed. It's as if they had no memory of the fact that they already did that a few times. But the rapture, the reset. Oh, and by the way, now with the Christians all gone, or whatever changed, whatever happened, I don't know. It's my theory. I don't know yet. But the different fire companies didn't get along with each other and started rivalries and fighting. And it broke out in 1819 when they had a riot or a row, you know. So in 1820, they changed the name from engine men to firemen. And rehired, reorganized everything, kind of like another whole reset in addition to the other ones we've mentioned. But instead of a reward-based system of paying people who show up at the fire first and then paying the people who fight the fire, they now have salaried people paid whether they fight fires or not, but they had a punishment system set up where you would be penalized and fined if you didn't show up or do things in time, or didn't do what the man with the badge says or tells you to do. So they had police. Now, they had already established a little bit of a police force already, but since the events, now in 1815, well, what they had to answer what happened to the previous police force when you're hiring a whole new one. Well, they said every member of the police board resigned before. They all resigned and went away. Really? Did they? So there was no police. In 1815, they had to start over. So they started over with a law that had a new system, but that new law was voted down. They said, well, and there are a lot of new citizens coming in because they were trying to repopulate the city. So it was very confusing. And they said it was impossible to conduct municipal interests of the place under the form of government that they had. So they had a complete governmental reset, which isn't too surprising, after the switch from being a British colony to an independent nation. But on a town level, it shouldn't be so confusing. I think a lot of the town's officers were gone. Maybe because of the war, maybe. But early in the civil year 1811, votes had passed in the town meeting for uniting the office of the county treasurer in one person so what, but even that little gesture, that little change or organization at this point, it created a disturbance among the populace. Discontent arose with respect to expenditures. Everything was just messed up. Early on in 1811, the trouble started. So they created a fire department. This is like a total reset. Of course, you'd expect that after the Revolution and everything, the War of 1812. But here comes Thomas Franklin Esquire. They had a system before. They talk about their memory of it for many years. Perfect arrangements. They said, well, it's being practiced in New York again here. The most experienced men gather together. Basically, it's like your fire department, okay? But they had that before, but it was just an understood thing that any able-bodied men would help out, the Bucket Brigade type thing. But now they have to, order it. And so they have all this pomp and circumstance and letters, and the authorities. It's weird because something changed drastically. Because now, when there's a fire, whoever goes to fight the fire, it seems, are just they're trying to steal or harass or harangue or cheer on the fire. It's insane. And the firemen consider themselves having to face dangers and things just from the citizens, and they had to have police, but they're risking their own, they're risking their own life and limb. And you'll see more of that here. The surrounding multitude have neither shame nor fear in refusing the fire ward and running away in masses as soon as he is seen with his badge of office advancing toward them. Or if a few yield a reluctant assent temporarily, they'll quit the line and leave the work assigned to them, basically to plunder or whatever. They're like a bunch of unruly children. The result of this state of things is as undeniable as it is inevitable, and the consequences and duties of it are equally plain and unquestionable. The system of depending upon the aid of the surrounding multitude must be abandoned, and with it the system dependent upon the mere influence or solicitation of sympathies. Wow! What happened? What happened between 1775 and now it's supposed to be like 1822? A system must be adopted suited to a large population. Well, they say that's what it was, but I think or I know later on you're going to see, the population had apparently a very marked decrease. In fact, that they have very little mention of any fires. Any fires in the years, like for example, in the year 1812, they had one fire. It's because the people were gone. Many of the people were gone. And it seems to me apparent, and you'll see the evidence, the people gone are Christians. The Christians were gone. They just disappeared off the face of the earth, apparently. So now we're into 1831. Can't be forgotten how the old popular, hazard of popularity it was to abolish the old fire department and have a new one established. The visible and active energy the members of the fire department take in active protection of the city against the element of fire has always been and must always be regarded, respected, I guess is what he's saying. And they start bad-mouthing the previous ones. They were, they say, oh, the old ones, they were prejudiced in favor of old modes and old weapons. So there's basically they're going to use technology to make up for the fact that their kindred spirit and their goodwill towards their fellow man is basically vanished. So they want more money, and they went on strike, threw down the engines. So the whole fire department went on strike, and the pay raise was refused, and all at once, all of the firemen on the same day were fired. And then they were once again relying upon the voluntary service, and it was just another reset. So 1831, another complete reset, and then again they sought the best model of engines, the best. So they're trying to rescue it all with technology and say, well, even though the whole fire department basically went on strike and we fired them all, and we're rehiring from scratch, we're working on this better technology of the fire engines. So, all right, so now we're going back a little bit. So we're talking about 1810. All right, so we're going to get and see what happened there. So here it is, 1810. There were only a few small fires, okay? Nobody's getting hurt, hardly anybody. 1812, even fewer. Just hardly any fires at all. I think, this is me, just me, I think the population dropped drastically, and they're not talking about it. It got blamed on the War of 1812, but something happened. Agenda 1812 or something happened. Okay? The population... In 1813, they only had one fire. Well, two fires, but the two fires happened at the one place, like on the same day. And it was a glassmaker. They have fires anyway. It just maybe it got a little bit out of hand or something. Probably because the real glassmaker was a Christian and went up in the rapture or something. I don't know. It seems like that, like somebody's in there just trying to learn how to do it. I don't know. It's conjecture, and they don't report that here, but I'm just trying to make sense of it, because there's a lot to... Like, why are they starting over? They say in 1814, the unhappy difficulties with England, they say, led to great excitement and fears in Boston. The town was in a defenseless condition. What happened to their defenders? The forts almost useless. Aren't they like brand new still at that point? And owing to bitter quarrels with the administration, no help had been given or was to be looked for from the national government. What happened to the national government? Hadn't it just started? It was organized. They had the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, all that good stuff. Our citizens took every possible measure to protect themselves. From what? From whom? One of which, from the fire, I guess, was stationing two of each at the engine companies. So they just had, like, it was like people wandering in, like your local librarian or your, whoever has to play fireman. Because the fireman was a Christian and all the firemen they're gone. They got taken up in the rapture or whatever happened to them. I don't know. They're starting over. An engine company was formed little service. A new one was asked for in 1814. In 1814, it was a free-for-all, like a post-apocalyptic scene. So the entire department was cautioned by the wards not to volunteer their services in any other capacity and to get the fire engines back into a state of operation, or in the best possible state of operation. And they had to do a head count literally in 1814, organizing to see that if they had identified enough men in case there was an alarm sometime again, they would rendezvous at this respective engine house. It's like a complete reset. It's like what happened to the people of the town before. What happened? Oh, they died in the war or whatever. Yeah, maybe, but to that extent, I don't know. It's crazy. And again, if you look around, you see no mention of Christians, Christianity, God, the Lord, anything like that. And we're in 1817. There was a boat in the harbor. It was ready to sail to France. And the crew went ashore to enjoy the festivities. And they had a colored steward left on the boat, on board. He was so angry at his treatment that about 11 o'clock in the morning he took revenge by discharging a pistol. In a barrel of powder stored among many others in the magazine of the ship. As a matter of course, the discharge blew the vessel into fragments. The affair was the origin of the famous byword of bygone days, "Who blew up the ship?" which was answered by the colored folks to whom it was always addressed, "Who put out the moon?" Okay. In the Bible it says that the sun and the moon are put out at the end times. Who put out the moon, alluding to a famous exploit of an engine company once dragged their engine to the end of the long wharf to extinguish what appeared to be a large fire, but proved to be only the rising of an extraordinary bright full moon on a somewhat hazy summer evening. I don't know about that. It's a nice story. Very, very interesting find here, I think. Who put out the moon? The colored folk ask the white folk who mistreat the colored folk who put out the moon. Interesting, I think. I really do. I have a theory, maybe, it seems, that the Christians are all gone. Where are the Christian men standing up for the colored guy who's being mistreated? They weren't there. They were all gone. Hey, it doesn't mean you have to be a Christian to have these kinds of morals. But if you just go with the times, and at the time, if it was acceptable to do that kind of mistreatment, they just go along with that, So, and then here, this is interesting. On June the 12th, 1817, the wards made a thorough examination of all the ladders furnished by the religious societies. Well, could they ask the religious societies? Why did they have to go and scout them out and do a survey and document and figure it out and back engineer all of the stuff that whatever the religious societies were doing to keep the town safe and have them repaired? Well, why weren't the religious societies keeping them up and repairing them themselves? Because they weren't there. They were gone. They were all gone. The Christians were all gone. I'm just reading on. They had to issue orders to have the ladders repaired and returned to their proper places. And to get the people to comply, Mr. Levi Melcher was appointed the keeper of the magazines at the Fort Strong on Noodle Island and placed under $5,000 bond. Yet still, he only remained in the position with this ladder a few weeks, and he was discharged and prosecuted by the wards. That sounds like, to me, it just sounds to me like it's chaos. It's hell in a handbasket. Everything's literally gone to hell. Now we're into 1818. Then this Exchange Coffee House, built at an expense of $500,000, was discovered to be on fire. Stone building. The height of the fire and possibility of getting the flames rendered the spirited efforts of the citizens and firemen of no avail. It was consumed in 3 hours. What? The dome fell with a crash. It was followed by the north and south walls, damaging nearby buildings because it was so huge. An immense concourse of citizens showed up to be spectators of the scene. It's like the first big gathering since the events, maybe. of the apocalypse or whatever happened. I don't know. The light penetrated far into the country, so as to be clearly visible upwards of 50 miles. The following morning, the front walls, 90 feet in height and 80 feet wide, fell. $500,000 domed, immense 90-foot stone building burns to rubble in hours. How? It stood tottering over the people's heads and threatened to crush the building opposite of it, but it was leveled without accident. The building covered 13,000 square feet on the ground and contained... That's a very tall building. Because that's not that huge, for 90 feet. It's like a skyscraper type thing. Contained 210 rooms. They examined it. This building had 210 rooms. But they say, a committee of wards investigated, said, that building wasn't as valuable as reported. Really? So what did they do? Well, they got together and they outlawed fire. An act to secure town from the damage by fire was passed. It says if they had no memory of the fact that they already did that a few times, but the rapture, the reset. And by the way, now with the Christians all gone or whatever changed, whatever happened, I don't know. It's my theory. I don't know yet, but the different fire companies didn't get along with each other and started rivalries and fighting. And it broke out in 1819 when they had a riot or a row, So in 1820, they changed the name from engine men to firemen, and rehired, reorganized everything, kind of like another whole reset in addition to the other ones we've mentioned. But instead of a reward-based system of paying people who show up at the fire first and then paying the people who fight the fire, they now have salaried people paid whether they fight fires or not, but they had a punishment system set up where you would be penalized and fined if you didn't show up or do things in time, or didn't do what the man with the badge says or tells you to do. So they had police. Now, they had already established a little bit of a police force already, but since the events, now in 1815, what they had to answer, what happened to the previous police force when you're hiring a whole new one? Well, they said every member of the police board resigned before. They all resigned and went away. Really? Did they? So there was no police. In 1815, they had to start over. So they started over with a law that had a new system, but that new law was voted down. They said, and there are a lot of new citizens coming in because they were trying to repopulate the city. So it was very confusing. And they said it was impossible to conduct municipal interests of the place under the form of government that they had. So they had a complete governmental reset, which isn't too surprising, after the switch from being a British colony to an independent nation. But on a town level, it shouldn't be so confusing. I think a lot of the town's officers were gone. Maybe because of the war, maybe. But early in the civil year 1811, votes had passed at the town meeting for uniting the office of the county treasurer in one person to the... So what, but even that little gesture, that little change or organization at this point, it created a disturbance among the populace. Discontent arose with respect to expenditures. Everything was just messed up. Early on in 1811, the trouble started, whatever it was. Probably not what they say it was. So, so a change had been effected in the minds of the inhabitants, subject to city government. Yeah, a lot of changes had happened. He concluded his remarks by reporting that he said that one person from each ward of the town with instructions to report a system of government in the town with such powers. So basically, martial law, and starting over, authorizing a kangaroo court, whatever, to constitute a city government just under one person. It's just martial law. The general's in charge or whatever. And so they sent out 12 people, 12 different sections of the city, just to rule over So the authorities organized the city of Boston again. And they started having people take oaths. That wasn't mentioned before. That's all new. And the fire department was sadly in need of a reform that would place it on equal footing to to meet the transition state under which everything was advancing. And they say by the increase of population, ties of individual interests were diminished, and so it was considered imperative to get things organized at that point. Things had changed since the colonial days, they say, when the inhabitants were few, they say, and the insurance system was not known. Well, because they took care of each other. The losses being sustained by the help of one another, Christians. Now they had to have insurance. So some of the citizens complained that the fire wards did not exercise their authority. They were despotic for the emergency. Like their predecessors should have been, like their predecessors. And, the fire wards asserted that the citizens no longer aided them in their duties by becoming members of the fire companies voluntarily. And the classes of population were now disposed to be inactive or to depreciate or deprecate. As the fires increased, those who were willing to assist decreased. They were much lessened, and all acknowledged that the fires were now more destructive than before, even though it had been outlawed a bunch of times. This was attributed not to any defect in the system, but for want of cooperation among the citizens. Interesting. Christians are absent? I wonder. You don't hear anything about Christianity here. Well, there is prayer, but that's more of the word of, like the request, right? I pray thee, sir, do consider this. Again, now in 1824, on December the 1st, the mayor fired everybody. At 1 o'clock on that day, all the captains of the engine companies resigned their care of the engines. So they had to replace all of the fire captains with aldermen. No event of similar character transpired in the country which has been the same. The theme of so much dissension and general conversation is the destruction of the Ursuline convent in the Charlestown district. What? August 11th, 1834, the facts of the case are as follows. They say, as far as we know, it's not really, that doesn't tell you the story, but about 2 months previous to its destruction, rumors were afloat that several people were confined in the nunnery against their will. Their friends were denied the privilege of visiting or even seeing them, and they were subject to tortures of an outrageous character as a punishment for their stubbornness and disobedience. Rumors were in circulation that one of the nuns had suddenly disappeared in a most mysterious manner, that the interior arrangement of the convent was conducted in a manner not strictly in accordance with the moral sense of the community. Now, all these things, as is well known, only tended to create a more bitter and hostile feeling in the minds of the citizens of Charleston against that institution. Story after story was circulated in regard to transactions which were reported as having transpired in the convent. The excitement ran very high at this time, yet nothing was done by those who had control of the convent to allay it in the slightest degree. Those who had control of it. What? Like temporary control? These are the tribulation times, in my opinion, post-rapture. The convent was empty of its normal people, and there were 2 nuns, only 2, and then they were held there captive and being inquired of and tortured, apparently. Like, what the heck? And then the crowd of people burnt down or destroyed the nunnery, the convent, the Catholic place there. It's insane. Like, what? Let's read more about it, because my theory is all the Christians were gone. So the nun made her escape from the convent at 12 o'clock. So this is like the rapture happens, and then a few girls go, or a few women go, and they decide that, oh man, that was where you want to be, and they became Christians after the rapture, and so then they are facing the tribulations. So she and other people, non-Christians, were put in charge of the convent when all the Christians were gone. That's what it seems like. Harrison made her escape from the convent at 12 o'clock noon and proceeded immediately to a friend's house in Cambridge. When the bishop learned of this fact, he proceeded to the house, accompanied by her brother, and had an interview, after which she consented to return on the promise that she should be released with honor in 2 or 3 weeks. By some means, it was alleged, this promise was not kept, and when these facts came to the knowledge of the citizens of Charlestown, they had handbills of the most exciting character posted up throughout the vicinity, calling a meeting of the citizens, taking into consideration to the best course to be pursued in relation to the matter. So great was the excitement that the selectmen of the town, in order to preserve the order and allay all the trouble, proceeded to the nunnery for the purpose of investigating the truth of the matter. On ringing the bell, they were asked their business, and so the bishop, he bluffed because he's trying to protect. He said he would bring 20,000 Irishmen to pull down their houses over their heads. 2 other visits were paid by the same gentleman with the same result. They finally had an interview with the bishop, and arrangements were made for them to visit the nunnery. Okay. So they show up, and they called. I'm trying to understand this, though, because they called upon the citizens to assemble, further declaring that the selectmen would not be allowed to enter the nunnery, that Miss Harrison would not be set at liberty. What? And it was time the citizens should take the matter into their own hands, etc. Okay, so he's calling for the citizens to help the poor nun being held at, of all places, the nunnery against her will, and being subject to things for what reason I don't know yet. They had a long conversation with Lady Superior and Miss Harrison. When they retired, it was too late to issue circulars containing the full particulars of the result of this interview. Giving such an account, their visit would allay the excitement existing in the minds of the public. Okay. And around 11 o'clock on Monday night, a large fire was made by burning several tar barrels at the highest point of a hill in the vicinity of the building. It's like burning a cross, like Ku Klux Klan or something. I don't know. Soon after, a party of 50 to 100 men disguised with masks and fantastic dresses and painted faces assembled in front of the building. Those are not Christians. This is a tribulation time here. And it's just like the purge, And after informing the inmates, the nuns, of the object of their visit, they gave them a half hour to pack up their bags and effects and leave the convent, after which they retired a short distance from the place to consult further with one another as the best course to pursue. So they say they allowed time for the nuns to vacate. And then when the time expired, whether they vacated or not, which they said they saw no appearance of the nuns, they commenced an assault upon the building. Some of the nuns were placed in carriages and taken to such a place as they desired. So they had, basically, it's like a purge. They show up, big crowd in masks and dresses, and they came in and they made demands, and the nuns spoke to them through the window and said, "We're fine, leave us alone." And they didn't leave them alone, and they had people sent out from there and burned the place down, hunted them down, whatever. Burned everything, their property, 3 pianos. There's no evidence that anybody was inmates or held captive there. They used that term. But people didn't leave with the crowd. They didn't trust the crowd. They tried to escape out the back. They said they allowed enough time for the nuns, so they burned the place down. One of the nuns was bedridden with the disease, so I don't know what happened to her. Strange times. The children who were there under their care were badly frightened. The distress and terror. It was a bad scene. And they worked their destruction until daylight, until the mob dispersed. All that was left of the St. Ursuline convent was blackened walls and smoldering ruins. This is according to their report. The inmates of the convent consisted of the lady superior, 6 nuns, 3 female attendants, and from 50 to 60 children, who were placed there for instruction by their friends, many of whom were Protestants. Now, why would they have done that? Why would the Protestants have placed their own children into this Ursuline school, Catholic school for instruction? Strange. Whatever the case. The fire department's report is what we're reading. So they said they got the alarm much later. When they arrived, they were prevented from helping. So they had a meeting in town where they once again outlawed fire. And they also outlawed hunting down, burning the property of, and murdering Catholics, Christians, whatever, Catholic Christians. Well, that's nice. The Protestant citizens of Boston, we pledge ourselves collectively and individually to unite with our Catholic brethren in protecting their persons and their property and their civil and religious rights. Now, I read a little bit more on this, and supposedly there had been this huge influx of Irish, like tens of thousands of Irish Catholics, I guess from the Great Potato Famine. You know, that's probably its own crazy story. It also happened probably around 1812-ish. Well, it just doesn't work in my mind. If there were so many Catholics there at that time, why is there just this one convent that's practically empty? And it seems like they're just beginning to operate again after some events around 1812. And they got persecuted. They got hunted down. They got burned. Basically burned at the stake on a hill, basically. I mean, and do you think that tens of thousands of Irish Catholics would stand by and allow a group of 60 or 80 so-called Protestant Christians to form a mob and go to their convent, St. Ursuline School and Church, make demands on the nuns and priests there, surround and set fire to the place, burn and bash everything up and everybody up over a period of hours and do nothing about it? I'm talking about Irish Catholics. Literal, not just second generation, third generation who are tough enough, but I'm talking about first generation immigrant Irish Catholics. Do you think they would allow this to happen? No. No way. No way, no way, no way, never. Wouldn't. So this doesn't add up to me. And then they have a town meeting. Now that town meeting would break out into a riot, believe me. But no, there are no Catholics there. To their credit, they did resolve that they're not going to do anything about what happened, but that they said they wouldn't do that type of stuff again. Maybe because there's practically like nobody left, you know? But that's just my opinion. I could be wrong. So next, just this little thing about this schooner named Sarah. Schooner is a boat, sailboat type thing. Blown to atoms, they don't know why. But I want to know, how do they even know about atoms in 1835? Well, this was written in around 1900, so you have to keep that in mind. But still, in 1900, did they know about atoms? I don't know. Do we know about atoms today? I've never seen them. I don't believe squat of what they say. They say the Earth is a ball, and I know that it is not a globe. 25,000 miles in circumference as a sphere. It is not. Saturday the 10th, a number of alarms were given for incendiaries, aka arsons, making an attempt on a Park Street church, the fire being ignited in one of the pews. Two fires were located at Roxbury, it's next door, the next day. And they made an endeavor to burn the State House down. What the heck? So then things get interesting because now we're getting into the big fire. And then on October the 23rd, they outlawed fire again and they established a fire department for the first time. Wow. It's a reset, I'm telling you. They had storage, they had unused apparatus like ladders, chained in certain places or not chained, but just leaning, or they had been moved away from their place. They kept them so the fire, because before then, the fire department was everybody. It's like you and me. Hey, if your neighbor's house is burning down, it's up to you. You're not. Nowadays, we've been conditioned to just wait for the fire department to show up and they'll take care of it. If they don't show up, let it burn, baby. No, they weren't like that. They had stuff. They were ready to go. They had the bucket brigades. They had the ladders strategically placed. Well, the people were all gone. The people who did that were gone. So they had to kind of reorganize everything. So they agreed. They had a committee, and then they said they would pay people. And then they claimed, why are all the people gone? Well, they explained it. Well, they were all discharged for neglect of duty because of a dispute over compensation. Well, it sounds plausible, but how many times is this going to happen? It becomes less plausible each time. Well, I say that there was a reset event and there was an extreme population decrease. It was like Agenda 1850. They had Agenda 1812, now it's Agenda 1850. The records of the appointment of company commanders from 1835 to 1858 are lost. No data exists. The company records remain blank. Yeah, reset event. What happened to the Christians, by the way? Now, I say that because I'm a Christian, so I'm biased, yes. In the religion that I believe in, you don't have these types of squabbles if you can help it. And I don't mean that I'm not saying that if you're not a Christian that you're going to believe in squabbling. I think you have to understand where I'm coming from, just where I'm looking at the language here and I'm looking at the way people behaved, and something changed. And it was a Christian city, it was a Christian town, and now the only mention of anything religious so far since 1812 has been these life and death struggles, in which this case it seemed to be the so-called Protestants hunting down and persecuting the Catholics, right? So for being not Christian, I guess. Well, this one engine company was disbanded supposedly on account of disturbances and quarrels among themselves. Okay, so now they're increasing the pay. The salary chief was increased to $3,300. Wow, that's high. And his secretary, in this case it would be, well, what secretary? I thought we had no records. Well, anyway, that person's paid $1,800, and it's not hush money. No, it's not hush money. $325 for the wards in certain wards, and then other wards where this fire isn't going to happen, and they don't have to do the hush money. They got an increase only to $175 a year. What? I mean, this is crazy. That's a lot of money there, but the $3,300 in $1,871, $3,300 in a salary. Wow. I mean, like in 1930, that'd be a pretty dang good salary, but 1871, holy smokes. Holy smokes, unholy smokes. Oops. All right. So So it turns out that that's not all that much money. So, sorry, I'm walking on a squeaky floor here. It's as if I live in a mud flutter. Well, maybe. So, I thought maybe they were paid off with these salary increases, but surprisingly enough, the value of $1 in 1871 in 2019 is $20.66. So you multiply that out, and it only comes to just over $72,000 for the fire chief. So that's not all that much. I'm sure they make a lot more money than that nowadays. I'm quite sure of that. So the value, I mean, like they weren't taxed as much, so it was a considerable amount of money, but I think it was comparable or comparable to what we pay them today. Not that they do anything that differently today. Who knows? Who knows? I'm not going to make any... Well, I'm not making a statement about that at all. California is a different story. Well, no, I am making a statement about Boston because there are things that have transpired in recent years in Boston of which the fire department would have to be privy and apparently is kept silent about. So, and well, be that as it may, let's not go there. Let's continue on. So Boston, in common with other large cities at the time, were visited with an unusual large number of large fires during 1871 and the loss of almost $750,000. Well, that was a decrease over the previous year, which isn't even really mentioned. 1870, they had a ton of fires. Wow. So the fires have picked up. The salaries have picked up a little bit. Salaries pick up a little more, and then they jump ahead a little bit, saying, they had to take care of that Coliseum building later, 1873. I'm not convinced that was a mud flutter if you look at it. Sounded like one, but what they show us as the Coliseum doesn't appear to be a mud flutter. So that to get ready for the big fire, they had all the horses sick. So the town is shut down. Business is shut down because all the horses are crippled up with an illness called epizootic influenza, and they had another name for it, but whatever. It was visited by a conflagration. Get it? So extensive in dimensions and appalling result that all others fade into insignificance. Well, that's not the first time they've said that. November the 9th, 1872. It was one of those beautiful September 11 days. No, it was one of those beautiful autumnal days so common in New England. The air was clear and exhilarating, not a cloud obscured the sun, and a gentle breeze veered occasionally 2 or 3 points. So why are they talking about the weather? Well, because there was probably talk of fire weather. That's my opinion. I didn't see that anywhere, but I'm not done because there is something that you'll see. So it did not exceed 7 miles an hour as the day went out. Twilight settled, and a more beautiful sunset was never seen. Sick horses were convalescent and on the road to recovery. So whatever made them sick was put to a halt because it had done the job that it needed to do, whatever that was. The fear which had hung over the city. What fear? Which had hung over the city for a week, like a cloud. I think the F is missing. The F is it's not silent and invisible. It's invisible but not silent. The city for a week, like a cloud, was gradually lifting and showed a silver lining. The wholesale business center of the city had been deserted. Why? Well, because the horses were sick and other reasons. And it had been surrendered. Bad idea. So the business center of the city had been deserted and surrendered, emptied out, to the guardians of its peace and safety. Horrible idea. And who was the last to see all this stuff? All these grand buildings. Who was the last there besides the guardians of its peace and safety? The owners and occupants of the great mercantile houses of brick, stone, and iron, all those flammable materials, having gone hours before to their respective homes with no warning or thought of impending danger. Wait, just a little bit earlier it said the fear which had hung over the city was gradually lifting. Well, apparently it had completely lifted, huh? Why? So the city's emptied out. No one's there except, and it's kind of vague. The guardians of its peace and safety. Well, why so vague? Well, because we find out that it was the military, or a military, maybe not their military, but like a militia, like a shadow government kind of off-brand military, like, you know, I mean, like nowadays it'd be like the city was in the hands of Homeland Security, or the city was in the hands of the Space Force, you know. So at the close of that beautiful day, the enemy appeared. Well, they were already there, guys. You left the city in their hands and attacked the very citadel of the city's strength, built of obdurate metal and mineral, you know, those flammable things. And it succumbed at the first onslaught. Clearly because metal and mineral, packed in solid form as structural components, are so flammable. You know, if you take a magnifying glass, if you're walking on a sunny day with a magnifying glass and you're not careful, you can just incinerate an entire building, right? That's the experience you've had too, right? No, not at all. Not at all. But I'm just reading this. I'll just read it again. On that beautiful day, the enemy appeared. What? The enemy? They're talking about fire. Ostensibly, it's the enemy of fire, but that they weren't afraid of. So if you're not afraid of it, is it an enemy? And attacked the very citadel of the city's strength, built of obdurate metal and mineral. And it succumbed at the first onslaught. And then they had a problem getting the alarms out, because the first alarm sounded at 7:20 p.m. at box 52, and was followed by other alarms calling the entire working force of the department, right? But so there shouldn't have been a problem, right? There was a fearful delay in sounding out the first alarm. What? This was caused by the fact that engine number 7 and hose number 2, those are both groups of firemen, were already at work, which impressed the officers on that beat. It impressed them with the idea that the alarm had already been turned in by some person who had discovered the fire. So they made assumptions. I don't believe that they would have made assumptions. I do not. Hence, the largest portion of the department was first notified by the brilliant pyrotechnic display which illuminated the entire city. Pyrotechnics illuminated the entire city. What? And the apparatus, which means the rest of them. And they keep referring to this apparatus, and I think it's supposed to mean the fire department, right? Hastened to this. The entirety of the fire department hastened to the scene, but it also kind of seems like they're talking about some kind of a device as well, an apparatus, the literal meaning of the word apparatus. It was 15 minutes after the fire was discovered by the men of engine number 7 before the alarm was sounded on the bells, by which time the fire assumed fearful proportions. If the city was emptied out and it was so quiet, I'm just thinking here, hang on a minute. If the city was so emptied out and it was so quiet, wouldn't the sound of just the men fighting the one fire have created a curious commotion heard? If you can hear I have really good hearing. If I can hear a bell at a great distance, and I know there are bells in university towers and things within earshot of me. I can hear trains miles away. When it's really quiet, like when there's the big football game, rivalry game, everyone's indoors watching the game, and I don't care about it, and I take my dog for a walk or something. It's the city that it's empty because the state team, is playing this other team, and yeah, it's like, that's like Armageddon there. But I can hear things from really far away. But anyway, apparently they didn't hear that. They could only hear the bells. It's like the bell didn't. Well, the bell. Like in A Christmas Story, the bell rang. Help me, help me. But the bell rang. It's like, but the bell didn't ring. Well, you got to go. There. It sounds like they're fighting a fire. Why don't we go check it out and send somebody to check it out? No, the bell didn't ring. The bell didn't ring. That looks like the aqueduct there. It's an elevated rail line or something. That burned too, it looks like, huh? That white. And this metal down here, you'll see it's twisted up. And what is it anyway? What's it holding up? And how deep does it go? You look, they ran these beams across the floor below ground level and put marble columns on it. I mean, so much of it doesn't make sense. Look at this sign. And they have signs, for the banks mainly, where to go to pay them interest. Gosh, that's a clean edge there. What is that? I guess that could be a rooftop. Just amazing. Okay, so here, granite. I said marble earlier, and I was thinking of this at the time. So on the 9th and 10th of November in 1872, this fire produced a firenado. It's the first description in history since the time the finger of God came down from heaven and blocked the Pharaoh of Egypt from pursuing Moses and his people, the Hebrews. After that point, I hadn't heard a description or read a description of a firenado until recent times in California. Well, that changed. I read it here, and I'll read it to you when we get to that point. But the heat from this fire, supposedly, was the heat from the fire, was so intense that it melted granite, solid granite. And you can see here, that is what they say the effects of the fire on these granite walls is. And if you look closely, you can see the dripping, melted granite. I mean, it could be that it looks that way because of the way it broke up and the quality of the image. And I suppose that's possible. But what do we have here? That looks like steel, but it's granite. That's what we're being told. I see wires coming out of it and going through it. So they drilled through it. I see rebar. I see brick. And then here looks like rebar. Perhaps they drilled into the granite and inserted rebar just to hold the columns together. But what causes the granite to pop like that? I guess the intense heat, uneven temperatures, is possible. What a shame and what a loss. But it looks suspiciously like, just incredible. So then we find out that they had these cockamamie plans in place where they put inside these high buildings, they put stores of, well, they say inflammable merchandise. Well, inflammable, it means what is understood by the layman, flammable or lights up, burns, right? But no, it's not just inflammable. They're talking about explosives. And the thought was that explosives would tumble the buildings and their contents into confused heaps of combustibles, which would not be defended as well as if they stood intact, right? And that if they did that, the thoroughfare would be blocked by the debris. But despite that, it was urged that the plans of the battle, as they were now well arranged and understood among the generals in command, that it would be interfered with by the desires of the inexperienced and excited men. And the powder was brought into requisition and used. So they did place barrels of explosives. It's just like 9/11 with the building. They wired it with explosives ahead of time. And then it had the effect anticipated by those who opposed its use. Now, this is written in such of a confusing way. Let me just tell you how I interpret it. The officials had stores of explosives saying that if the fire would spread, if there would be a fire that spread, that if you blew the building, then it would prevent further spread of the fire. But that was a lie, because it was just meant to take down the buildings and make the fire spread, which it did, because it blew hot embers everywhere, and it's just a daisy chain of explosions, basically. That's why it sounded like 100 cannons going off, I think. The fire raged for 18 hours with relentless fury. The streets became veritable blowpipes by reason of their narrowness and the height of the buildings upon them, causing such intense heat that the blocks of granite stores would melt, as it were, and fall before the flames had approached within 500 feet of them. Wow! Blocks of granite stores would melt, as it were, and fall before the flames had approached within 500 feet of them. What? How would that be possible? That's insane. That's directed energy weapons, to me. Directed energy weapons. At last, the working force had been so augmented, blah, blah, blah. So now we have fire nados and directed energy weapons. Wow. They said it was such a long superhuman struggle. But wait, there's more. The limits of the fire were now defined, and further spread was out of the question. So they directed their work to the interior of the buildings, partially destroyed on the boundaries of the fire. And who? The military. What's the military got to do with it? What's the military organization doing here? The military organizations were doing magnificent work in keeping the curious-minded back from dangerous positions. Stupid idiots, town folk, right? You have to have the military with bayonets, keeping them back from dangerous positions. Details of the grand army of firemen were posted to take care of the ruins. Yeah, take care of them, all right? They just blasted them. And you wonder about it sounded like cannon fire. Well, you got barrels of gunpowder, and you've got the military who have cannons, right? Details of the grand army of firemen were posted to take care of the ruins, and tranquility again took possession of the city. Whatever. So they had the military in there keeping everybody back. So who knows what really transpired. But on midnight the next day, Sunday, it was aroused again by a terrific report. That means a boom or a bang or a shot like a cannon or like a barrel of gunpowder. They say it was by a gas explosion on Sumner Street near Washington Street, which caused a general alarm to be sent in. Wonder if that one was delayed. The explosion took place in a block. Whatever. The front and external wall was blown into the street.
So the explosion took place on the inside. The merchandise with which the building store was ignited, and a terrific fire was again in full blast at close proximity to the two largest dry goods stores in the city. They were on the hit list. They didn't get nixed the day before. The excitement caused by this fire was even greater than that of the night before, but the excellent work of the military in keeping the people at proper distance. So the tally, at the end of the day, it cost $75 million. The buildings that burned, 776, of which 709 were brick and stone. You know, that flammable brick and stone, that kind. And 67 wood. Well, 67 wood would make sense. Wow. So they start handing out awards. Ex-Chief Damrell was honored by the Masons at one of the many, I think 5 or 6 different Masonic lodges in the city of Boston at that time. And he was presented with a silver tea set, basically a silver service valued at $3,000, which would be about $60,000 or more, well, more than $60,000 in today's 2019 dollar value, where at Tremont Temple. The presentation was made by the ex-mayor, the Honorable William Gaston. Gaston. Speeches were also made by several prominent Masonic citizens. Yeah. And then this other ex-chief engineer was an orphan, like so many. He was just a runaway, runaway. And he had neither money nor influential friends, so he was easy prey and called into action. And he got rewarded for blowing up and burning down the city with the other co-conspirators. Fire Commissioner David Chamberlain was reappointed, and he got a salary, increased to $4,000 a year. That's a lot of money back then. It is. So what did they destroy? Well, let's give you an idea. Technasma, architechnology, electricity. Here's how it works. In the video you're about to see, we have just uncovered an example, if it turns out to be true and not fabricated, but it fits everything I've learned. It kind of fits it all. And it's known that if you have an anode and a cathode, you're going to produce a current if you have one of them grounded, and then you have the other one gathering atmospheric energy by means of elevation. So you have an increase of voltage as you go up in altitude. So with these metal roofs and these features on the roofs, they're not just lightning rods, and they're not just meant to keep the rain out, but they serve the purpose of producing electrical current, and that can be routed and made in such of a way through, I don't know if it's fractals or exactly how they do it, haven't figured that out yet, but they create like a static charge or spark gap somehow in the air and on these spires, and they produce light. And I've seen it in the photos, well, not so much the photos, but the drawings, because this is an older technology. I mean, this is something that is, I would have thought was really ancient, but it's been around, and I wouldn't have thought that it was still around anywhere. But in this case, I'm not sure if they reconstructed this temple. It's kind of sketchy. It's in Cambodia, and I looked into it more, and the temple is it's in a town called Phnom. I don't know how to pronounce it. P-N-O-M, and well, just have a look, and I'll explain how I think it works. So I've told you they have one part of it grounded, and then the rest is not. They use elevation. They use a lot of metal up there. The shapes matter for the gathering. I think that the spire and the upward points and various elements of the shapes, the windings of it, I think matter. But also, if you see it, it has all these, all the columns. And I don't think that many columns would be necessary to support that weight, and they seem very specific. Well, I think the columns, they remind me of something that it's kind of like a resonance, okay? So I think there is definitely a resonant frequency associated with it. And one of the commenters on the other video I did found that it comes up with specific numbers, which I'll put on the screen, of hertz. And one of them I think was C sharp. Was it C sharp 2? And so those tones are very specific, and they are found more than in just this video that you hear from the tones. And oftentimes these buildings have an organ or some kind of a musical or some kind of a resonant instrument. So it may be that they use that to activate the process, and they may also use it to end the process. And I think they did it in such of an elegant fashion. It was so refined that they incorporated music and dance in the production of electricity and light. It must have been fabulous. It must have been spectacular. And it's been lost, and they are I'm not saying that they've destroyed it in the past. I'm not saying that they've tried to destroy it. They destroyed it, and they are destroying this stuff. They're destroying it right before our very eyes, and we need to stop them from doing that, because what was lost does not seem inherently evil. It just seems like it would help society to have free electricity. And the culture, besides that, the lost art is an abomination. It's an abomination to destroy good art, holy art, uplifting art, beneficial, beautiful artwork. And that's the architecture of these buildings. It is beautiful. And then these porthole things, they're not clocks. I don't care how obsessive people are about time. It's not necessary to have that many clocks. It's just not. So it's Phnom Penh Royal Palace and Silver Pagoda. And I know I hesitate to put that out there. I would say, based on what I've read, don't go there and don't try to investigate this. Just leave them alone. All right? But I found a picture where I think it was the very same one. Yes, this picture. Look at this. Is that just light reflecting off of it, or is it producing light? It's rather interesting to me. So that makes two examples. Now, obviously, they could have put an electric light up there, just so that skydivers don't get the temple point right up betwixt the nethers or something. I don't know, because it's pretty low for planes to worry about. But I think they're producing electricity there, and it's just kind of hidden there in plain sight. So, and then just researching the town, it seems like they've had traditionally a good understanding of electricity. So, if you're like me, like a lot of people, you think that everybody got electricity after the United States and Europe and everything. And, well, I mean, we're taught ridiculous things, and I exaggerate, and it's funny, I think, but we're practically taught that, Benjamin Franklin invented lightning and Thomas Edison invented electricity. It's just that's the way those men are great men. Well, I beg to differ, and I think that a lot of other people understood a lot more about electricity, and still do apparently, than I thought even was in the realm of possibilities. So, like I said, they had a classical Cambodian dance stage in the pavilion, which is sometimes lit at night to commemorate festivals or anniversaries. So maybe it's not a completely lost art, and I would love to see that. And I'm sure it's beautiful, and I hope the exposure that it's getting helps and doesn't hurt, because I think that we have to respect their traditions and everything. That's why it exists, is because of the respect. Now, the Khmer Rouge went through, apparently, according to the official narrative, and destroyed everything. I don't know what to believe about that. I haven't researched it. But if the Khmer Rouge were so terrible, why is this there? I mean, I'm not saying they weren't terrible. I'm just fascinated by the fact that this, we're not terrible, right? We have a sense of history, and, well, the United States doesn't have history, right? Europe's the old country. I'm finding out differently now. I think some of these structures in Boston were perhaps much, much older than previously thought. Now we're still in Cambodia here. I mean, look at that. It's beautiful inside there. Peaceful.
Well, there you have it. Boston. It's not just another documentary out of Boston.
I can't complete this video about Boston. And look at that mud flutter. Man, that's beautiful. And that is too. But I can't complete this video. I'm not sure what to think. It looks like a beautiful lady, but I'm very cautious nowadays. Anyway, I can't do the city of Boston without mentioning Richie from Boston, who I was a very, very small YouTuber, not but a year ago. Coming up on my I'm looking at my oldest videos, and they still just say 1 year ago. That's how quickly all this stuff has happened. It's been more than a year. I think it's been almost 2 years since my first video about fake space, when I realized space was fake, and I made a video about it and published it. So, but yeah, it still says just a year ago. So I think it has to actually have been 2 years before it says 2 years ago. So anyway, I made a playlist of classic videos. But anyway, my most popular video is closing in on 1 million views, and that's about the first photo of the dome firmament. And Richie from Boston noticed that, and he made a comment on that video, and he must have talked about it to his subscribers. And at the time, I don't know how many he had, but a lot, probably more than I have now, a lot more. And sent some of them over my way, and that kind of got me going. I got to 1,000 subscribers pretty quickly after that. And you know, it's continued at a pretty rapid pace. I'm sure it'd be much better if I weren't throttled, but I'm sure what I'm doing, if it were less valuable, it probably wouldn't be throttled either. I don't know. I think you know, there are opposing forces out there, and I think Richie seems to be a good force on the good side. And Richie from Boston, here's to you. He's the toast. He should be the toast of the town, not the fire chief after the town burns down. People like Richie from Boston should be the toast of the town. It won't be that way because the world we live in, but you know, that was evident. Although the world seemed more cordial before 1812, and that was really trippy to go through this. And I'm not saying that I think that a rapture happened in 1812. I'm thinking end time like events happened in 1812, and it may just be that around the time of 1812, it may be that time in which Christ was crucified. What about that? Have you ever thought of that? It may be that he wasn't joking when he said, I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass before all these things are accomplished because of me. A generation could be as much as 1,000 years, as many as 1,000 years. So I think with this mystery that we're dealing with, we have a compression of time as we find out the truth. And of course, the millions of years is not seeming to be the case, although it may be true outside of this era or this realm that we're in. But this earth and this reality and this world that we live in, I think is very young, very much younger even than the 6,000 years that I believed for a long time. And I'm not saying that the Bible is wrong. I think the Bible's timeline is correct. However, I made an assumption that I knew how many years transpired since the time of Christ's crucifixion and today, because we went from an epoch in our naming of the years, from an Anno Mundi, which would be since creation, we moved from that to Anno Domini. So I'm thinking now it may have been around 1812. If Christ was crucified in what we know as 1812, that would explain a lot. And if the world had a little bit more technology, and if the world were interconnected via telegraph lines, if the world had communications maybe of a different nature that were more advanced, then when Jesus told his disciples to go out and preach to the whole world, he wasn't being ignorant and saying, go out and preach to part of the world, the part of the world you know about, and don't worry about the rest. That doesn't make sense to me. As I sit here, I tell you, I believe what Jesus said. I believe that Jesus knew about the world. And when he said the world, he wasn't parsing words. He was just speaking truth. He said, go out and preach to the whole world, meaning Alaska, meaning Antarctica, meaning North America, South America, Guam, the Philippines, Cambodia, Estonia, Tartary, Grand Tartary, wherever that is, bounded, the highest mountain, the deepest depth. Nothing can separate you from the love that is in Christ Jesus. It all fits together. Why don't you give it a try with what the scripture says? And so when Jesus says, go out and preach to the whole world, what if he meant that? And what if Nero was in charge of this whole world? Maybe it was, the destruction of Jerusalem, 70 AD. That may have been tied into these events of 1812. And even 1812 is a little sketchy, because when you go to 1850, I hit a wall at 1850. It seemed like there was almost nobody around in 1850. Nothing was happening in 1850. And I don't know how you are, but if you go back in your own family records, everything we have, it's like this whole place was set up in 1850 almost. It's really strange. And I think a lot of this information has come to light since 2012, and it's almost like a veil was lifted, or a seal was broken, or a cat got out of a bag somewhere. Somebody left their barn door open and the horse went running out, type thing. Well, that's maybe not the best analogy, but all this information. I mean, look, this is melted granite. I mean, I looked at it and I thought, no, it looked like it just popped, But then later I read, and you heard me, that they said that granite melted and it was still 500 feet away from the nearest flames. It doesn't compute. That dog don't hunt. Okay, it just doesn't work. Physics. I know physics. Okay, it doesn't compute. 500 feet away, unless you're shooting a laser, directed energy. You have to be directing energy for that to happen. You have to be directing energy to get steel beams to bend and melt and all this type of stuff. And they admittedly had gunpowder and who knows what other incendiaries present. Plus, there's the sound of cannon fire, and they had the military, which is known for what? Cannon fire, right? Firing cannons, cannon fire. Yeah. Yeah. Military. Don't leave your city in the hands of military, especially during peacetime. That's when they seem to be really dangerous sometimes, It's crazy. So that's the history through the firefighter's eyes. I think it was a clever way for me to show you how, in the form of a very, very deep dive, how all this stuff can fit together. And with that, I'm wrapping it up. I hope you enjoyed it. This one took quite a while, so I apologize for the delays. Many of them were not my fault. Had some rendering issues, and getting this thing uploaded could take, half a day with the data caps I'm dealing with. It's crazy. So I'll get going on that, and hope you enjoyed, and cheers. Have a good one.